Welcome back to NewsWire here on SportsGrid. One really big possibility out there for you at running back in fantasy football this week on the waiver wire. Definitely want to get to that because you may be surprised if you take a look to see who could be out there. But first, let's bring in Joe Pisapia to get into the week ahead, and we'll talk about some of the big winners and losers in fantasy football and the bye weeks and everything else. And it does feel like, Joe, we're at the point of the season where a lot of folks know what their destiny is at this point, but I try to always say, got to fight to the end, right? No matter what your record is.
Yeah, look, I think if you are 5-3 right now, you're in a good spot. If you're 3-5, you're not out of it. If you got 1 or 2 wins, it's going to be tough. I know we got more bye weeks coming up this week too, some more players missing, but it's been brutal in terms of injury. We lost more people this week, as you were alluding to, the Cam Scadaboo injury. I know we're going to touch on that. So, and then we lost some players that we didn't anticipate on Sunday, like Drake London, sort of coming out of nowhere there. So that hurt a lot of people and sent a lot of people to the waiver wire early. So this is kind of a tricky week in terms of what's left on the branches here for us to pluck off.
Browns, Jets, Eagles, and Buccaneers are off. So, the obvious names are there. Not many from the Jets and Browns, but the Eagles have a litany of guys that you're not going to be able to play. The Buccaneers have been fantastic in fantasy. So those teams are off this week as well. And so, Joe, before we get into the fantasy winners, 6 teams off at once is just a monster in fantasy. Really hard to rebound from that, but a lot of big names on the sit list this week for Philadelphia and Tampa Bay.
Yeah, and I just don't understand, as we talked about last week, why they can't spread the wealth a little bit when it comes to these bye weeks. I don't understand, why can't we do 4 a week, make it a little bit easier? But the NFL is going to NFL, and they're going to do whatever they want. So it's been really challenging. And also, we've lost so many premium players all year. Joe Burrow going out, Malik Neighbors going out. The list goes on and on of the guys that we've lost. Now, the good news, are getting some players back from bye week and from health issues. So Puka Nacua is back this week. He's going to play, so that's a positive. So, not everything in terms of the sky is falling upon us is true, but it is getting harder and harder. And I think the players that you start to speculate on, as you're starting to see, getting ahead of some of these running back situations before other injuries happen, now is the time to find those handcuffs that could be useful, like Isaiah Davis. Some other guys, Devin Neal is another one too, that Kamara's come up a little lame recently. So that's another deeper name. So there's guys out there that you should be rostering. So when the next Tyrone Tracy incident pops up, you are ahead of the game instead of chasing it.
Yeah, Ray Davis, another one on Buffalo, which leads us to the week that James Cook had this past week. Wow, over 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. Cook has been, a little hit or miss this season, but you really can't complain. I mean, the guy is going to help you get to the fantasy playoffs. But this Jonathan Taylor discussion, we just list the guy every week. I would assume that drafting for next year, he's the number 1 overall pick in fantasy football. The guy scores 2-3 touchdowns every single week. And then also on that list there, you saw, Joe, was really good timing for the Jets if they want to trade Bree Hall, because I don't think he's going to have a better game than he had this past week over the course of the season.
No, absolutely not. Look, Bree Hall gave his best audition there, so now's the time to deal him. If you're the Jets, you've got to accumulate picks. He's not part of the long-term plan because there's no long-term plan. So get all the picks you can and start to create that plan. I think that's very smart. And Jonathan Taylor, I think certainly could be a top 5 pick next year. I think Bijan and Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson still would be ahead of him theoretically, but Jonathan Taylor is going to be right there in that conversation. It all depends on how much volume he ends up getting between the playoffs too. It's something to keep in mind, right? Saquon Barkley had over 400 carries last year, and he hasn't been the same guy up until this past week. And this past week, he had that full workload, and he came up with a groin injury. So a little something there to just keep in mind. But Taylor's performance has been MVP-esque. He's had 4 games over 100 yards this year, 5 over 90, and 4 different games where he's had multiple touchdowns. So he's basically carrying fantasy rosters. And I guarantee you, if there was a study of undefeated teams, the highest rostered player is probably Jonathan Taylor, because he's been so consistent. And let's be honest, I said this on my shows during the week too. The Colts are not just AFC cute, oh, you're adorable, good. They're good. They're actually good, and they are showing teams, I think, right now how good they are. Lou Anarumo is doing a great job on the defensive side. They're doing a great job on the offensive line too. And Daniel Jones is being proficient. And I think that's all that Shane Steichen needed. And now Steichen's going to be a guy that's going to take Gardner Minshew and Daniel Jones to the playoffs, which is pretty impressive in terms of resume. And it makes you wonder just how bad Anthony Richardson was, that he couldn't figure things out there with Shane Steichen.
Yeah, probably needs a change of scenery, I would guess, next season, but he'll get another chance to start, I would think. We showed a graphic before, by the way, most running back PPR points since 2007. You see that McCaffrey and Taylor, 1 and 2 there. Let's
Hmm.
also show some love to Todd Gurley, who had an incredible 3 year run and then screwed everybody in the Super Bowl, if I'm not mistaken there. But as far as week 8 fantasy losers are concerned, I mean, Joe, the Bengals just basically gave their season away in that loss to the
Hmm.
Jets this past week. And another loser, of course, you have here in the Atlanta Falcons. This is the mysterious team of the season. One week they look like they're a potential playoff contender. The next week they look like they'll be drafting top 10 this year. I don't know.
Yeah, look, all of those are true. It's funny because the Cleveland Browns not only gave away Flacco, right? They also cut Tyler Huntley, and then Huntley went back to Baltimore and just won them a game this week. So they've done a bang up job of helping everybody else in their division this year, the Cleveland Browns, in terms of getting other quarterbacks out there. But yeah, it's unfortunate set of circumstances there. Godsend for Jamar Chase. You got to love that. Cam Scadaboo injury is it's just awful. It's just, he's fun. If you love football, it's hard not to love Cam Scadaboo if he's not on your team. And you saw even the Eagles fans, notorious for being, well, special when it comes to these sort of situations. They stood up and applauded and gave him the slow clap. I mean, that just tells you Cam Scadaboo has a respect factor, I think, that goes pretty league wide. And then the Falcons, a terrible loss here. Like, I know they had to pivot to Kirk Cousins, but this was a smash spot here for Bijan Robinson and company. The Miami Dolphins, awful on defense all year. They have given up over 1,100 yards rushing going into that game. No other team had given up 1,000, and yet Bijan can't get going. What happened here to the Falcons? I know London was out. I know Penix was out. But how they couldn't manage this football game better with the defense and how it's played this year is shocking to me. So credit to Miami Dolphins. They showed up, but a really bad look for the Atlanta Falcons this week.
Yeah, definitely. Not a game that was close. Okay, so this is probably the last time in the season where the waiver wire is going to include a player that we would call a potential league winner. And it's funny is that I think, Joe, this Tyrone Tracy situation for the Giants is very unique in the sense that most savvy leagues, a player like this is owned. And I think he's probably
Yeah.
owned in a lot of leagues. But because he missed so much time and because Cam Scadaboo was just on fire and Singletary was the backup, I think there's some shocking leagues that are like, wait a second, how is Tracy still available here? I didn't even realize it. So I would encourage a lot of people out there, don't just assume that this is the case because he was out for 5-6 weeks. It was a non-factor. Now I think he's the top waiver wire pickup of the season, right?
Well, and a lot of teams, well, not about the season quite yet. We'll see how, look, we know what he is. He's an RB2, right? Like, he has some fumble issues, but he's going to get the full workload here, probably a 70-30 split with Singletary. But you're right. If you look at that roster percentage, it's only about 35% on Sleeper, which is where those active leagues are. If you look at Yahoo, the consensus was even lower for him. So kind of shocking there, but I think between the bye weeks and the injuries and the roster crunches people had, they just couldn't afford to hang on to Tracy anymore. He's a guy that's been dropped in a lot of leagues in the last 2 weeks. So people were hanging on to him. They weren't sure, and then they had no choice. I mentioned some of the other guys here on the list to be looking at too. Tashi Spears, another one too. If Tony Pollard should get traded, he would get a full workload. He worked a ton in the passing game this past week. We've talked about Kayshon Boutte. He scored again. Isaiah Davis, another guy to stash as well. Devin Neal, Tank Bigsby, those are some guys too to be stashing right now. Tank Bigsby looked really good in that offense. They've been told right now that Saquon Barkley is going to come back and play at some point. Also, Christian Watson, another guy I would throw out on that list too. Finally returning. Nobody's really stepped up in that void here since Jaden Reed went down. And Jordan Love is playing great football. So I think those are some names that might still be floating out there, but it's very tough right now on the waiver wire streets to get guys to come in and play. Chimere Dike also has emerged in Tennessee, but again, Tennessee offense kind of lackluster. So it's a tough week there, but you got to spend a lot if you want Tracy.
Definitely so. You mentioned Noel. That was a good pickup last week. And even though he did fine, Hutchinson did well as well. Maybe Houston's got another wide receiver in the mix too. Thanks again, Joe. Have a good week.
Thanks for having me.